Welcome to Sports Spectrum, the sports and faith podcast that brings Jesus back into the conversation. Here's your host, Jason Romano.
Welcome to the show, everyone. I'm Jason Romano. Today on the podcast, we welcome Rachael Denhollander to the program. Rachael is an attorney, advocate, and educator who was the first woman to speak publicly against former USA Gymnastics team doctor Larry Nassar, one of the most prolific sexual abusers in recorded history. As a result of Rachael's activism, more than 250 women came forward as survivors of Nassar's abuse, leading to his life imprisonment. Rachael was named one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people and one of Glamour magazine's Women of the Year in 2018. She also received the Inspiration of the Year Award from Sports Illustrated and was a joint recipient of ESPN's Arthur Ashe Courage Award. Rachael Denhollander has released 2 books that are out now for everybody to read. The first is her memoir. It's called What is a Girl Worth? It's a powerful book to tell a powerful story of Rachael's life. And she also wrote a children's book called How Much is a Little Girl Worth? And it's a beautiful illustrated book about the value and worth of kids and just their value and identity and how much God loves them. Rachael is in many ways a hero. And if you read the inside of her book and you look at some of the endorsements, Beth Moore, the New York Times bestselling author, also a sexual abuse survivor, writes, "This is one of the most important books you'll ever read." And the actor Terry Crews wrote, "Do not miss the incredible story of Rachael Denhollander, the woman who stopped an abuser. She is a living example of grace and strength in the fight against evil, and I'm standing by her side." This is a tough interview. This is a powerful interview. I don't think you need to ask the kids to go into a different room. I think this is PG rated, so kids can hear this interview as well. But it does tackle a very tough topic in sexual abuse and sexual assault. But it's one that needs to be told. Rachael courageously told that story, and we're going to bring that to you here on Sports Spectrum. Take a listen to Rachael Denhollander, author of the new book, What is a Girl Worth?, here on Sports Spectrum's podcast. Rachael, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's good to talk to you, Rachael. The book is called What is a Girl Worth? It is as powerful and as transparent a book as I've ever read, especially coming from somebody who tried to write a book that was as transparent as I could, and I'm reading yours, and I'm just blown away by what you wrote. And a lot of people know about your story, of course, but let's share, I guess, with the listeners as we start here about the book and your decision to tell your story in book form, because writing a book is not easy. It's a hard decision to dive deep into that, to bring back all the memories and all that. So share with us what that was like and why you decided to write this book.
Yeah, you're right. It was not an easy decision. In fact, for a long time, I said, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to write a book, and turned down a lot of offers. And I really got to the point where I said, it is the benefit, the potential benefit is worth the risk and worth the cost that it's going to be. And the reason I really feel that way is, the answer to a question that I got asked this week, what was left to tell? Yeah, and the answer is really almost everything. Because everyone, the world kind of tuned in by and large on a grand scale during the sentencing hearing, where they saw 156 women come together and stand up and confront their abuser and participate in putting him away for life. But what people don't know is what it took to get to that point. And for many people, there's almost this sense of Larry's demise was inevitable. They kind of tuned in at the end where we already knew who he was, and we already had, legal precedent behind us, and we had an army of survivors who were speaking up. But that's not what it was like for the first 2 years of fighting this battle to get to this point. That's not what my experience was like leading the charge to fight this battle. And it's not what it had been like for the 30 years prior, where women were speaking up and children were speaking up over and over again and being silenced. And so really what I wanted to do with this story was to give voice to all of the survivors and to what we had to go through to get there, to tell the untold story of what it took to take on two major institutions, Michigan State University and USAG, the United States of America Gymnastics. And ultimately, even the USOC, the United States Olympic Committee, and multiple law enforcement agencies, all of whom had been sheltering Larry for decades.
Yeah, you mentioned it was, a couple years of a process. It starts with the book, really right in the beginning with an email that you began to put together, August 4th, 2016, 10:32 a.m. And I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about the importance of that email that you wrote that day, and obviously why that was important for you to put that in the very beginning of the book.
Yeah, I think that scene really sets the stage for what happened before, how we got there, and then what follows, what transpires after that. So that was the email that I wrote to the Indy Star in 2016, where I told them my story, and I said, I'll come forward as publicly as necessary if you can just get the truth out. And that was really the moment that I had been waiting for 16 years. When I began to realize what Larry had done and that he was an abuser. I was around 17 years old when I began to really realize what had happened and come to grips with this. And at that time, my mom and I had a conversation. What do we do with this information? We didn't know we didn't understand the depths of the abuse yet. But I knew enough to know that I wasn't his first victim and I wasn't going to be his last. But when I looked at the situation, I said, I can't do this alone. I can't do this anonymously. I have to have media pressure. We have to have some way of getting the narrative outside of the control of the organizations that are sheltering Larry. We have to have some sort of way of wresting control, even from law enforcement agencies, and putting the pressure on them to handle this investigation right. Because the last thing that I wanted to do was come forward in a way where Larry would know he was empowered to continue. And at 17, I just didn't know how to do that. And so for the next 16 years, what really happened was I spent time putting the case together. My mom and I got a hold of my medical records and started compiling an evidence file in case I ever had the opportunity to speak up and be believed. I researched pelvic floor therapy. We talked to experts, and I just prepared for any possible chance of being believed. And I watched Larry's career, and I watched MSU and USAG, and I just never saw any crack in that armor until the Indy Star article. And in that article, Larry wasn't named, but what the Indianapolis Star had done was an in-depth investigation into how USAG was handling sexual abuse. And they had really blown the whistle on the corruption in the organization. And that article was trending, which was very important because it meant that people were paying attention and that for the first time, a whistleblower was being believed. And so I wrote immediately to the Indy Star. And I said, I wasn't abused by a coach, but I was abused by the Olympic team doctor. Here's what happened. And I will come forward as publicly as necessary if you can just get this story out, if you can get the truth out. And I knew what that would mean for myself and for my family and just the train of events that would unleash. But it was a chance. And I thought a chance was worth it.
It's completely worth it. But can you take us through a little bit of the fear and the anxiety, if that was even something that you wrestled with? Because I know your faith's important to you, and I want to talk about that aspect as well. But just, you say 16 years, and then you see a little crack, right? And you decide, okay, now's the time to say something. There had to be some fear there and a little bit of concern, like, okay, this is going to open up a can of worms and we saw what can of worms it opened up. But I'm sure that you received backlash. I'm sure that you received people from those sides, whether it's the USAG or Larry or Michigan State, telling you this is not true, this is not cool, whatever. Can you walk us through just the emotions and the thoughts and what you were going through to even get to the point to finally hit send on that email?
Yeah, it was a years-long process of understanding what it was going to take, and so in one sense, when I hit send on that email, there wasn't a choice. I knew how it had to be done. I knew there wasn't an option, and I was very firm in my resolve to do it. I had spent 16 years thinking through, what is this going to have to look like? How is it going to have to be done? How do you put the case together, just in case there was ever a chance? And so I knew exactly how it had to be done. At the same time, being a trained attorney and having studied the dynamics of abuse for so long and understanding who Larry was in the institutions that surrounded him, I was also very painfully aware of what that would unleash. That it was a choice to have very graphic details about my abuse out there forever. I understood what it was going to unleash in terms of the legal process, and the commitment that was going to be. To see a police report and a prosecution through, if we could even get an investigator to take it seriously and a prosecutor to pick up the charges. I understood that would mean continual media interviews. If the story picked up steam, that my abuse would be international headlines. And I understood the repercussions from a community standpoint and even a church standpoint. Because as soon as someone identifies you as an abuse victim, oftentimes what happens is it really shuts down any avenue of communication because you're immediately categorized into wounded and other. And so when you express concerns, when you engage in advocacy, your voice is immediately shut out as, oh, but you're just imposing your viewpoint on everyone else. And so I knew when I hit send on that email that it was really going to impact every single facet, not just of my life, but of my family's life, that my children would pay the price for what we would have to go through to see this through, and that it was an entire family commitment really for the rest of our lives.
Rachael Denhollander is our guest here on Sports Spectrum. The book is called What is a Girl Worth? The book's only been out a little while here. It's certainly available everywhere books can be found, and I encourage everybody to read this book. It's a very important book, I think, to read. Can you share with us a little bit of the aftermath in releasing the book and the reaction that you've got? Good, maybe some bad, but I imagine you've had a lot of emails, a lot of different, maybe it's social media posts, text, tweets, whatever, from people telling you their reaction to reading this. What has that been?
By and large, it has been overwhelmingly supportive, and I'm deeply grateful for that. There's been a lot of messages that have communicated that it's doing, what I hoped and prayed it would do, giving voice to survivors who aren't seen and heard, helping people understand abusive dynamics, helping people wrestle with ultimate life questions like, how do I make my decisions? What am I prioritizing? Where is my value found? And really telling a very compelling story about what it takes to fight major organizations and institutions, and to see the hand of providence through that. So I'm deeply grateful for that. There has been backlash. Excuse me. There has been backlash. There always is. It's a lot of the same types of things survivors always hear. Oh, you really are just in it for the fame. You really did just want the money.
Yeah.
And the typical attacks that victims always undergo when they speak up. I wish I could say that wasn't present, but it is an ever-present dynamic for those of us who are survivors.
Rachael, let me ask you about your growing up, your childhood, your faith. That's really something we haven't talked much about. We'd love to hear testimonies, and I think just starting with your faith testimony is important because it really guides you into this whole journey that you take through, commencing with writing this book. So share with us where that faith dynamic began for you and when you began to trust in the Lord.
Mm-hmm. I was very blessed to be raised in a Christian home with godly parents who did just a phenomenal job really transmitting the truths of Scripture to me and just weaving it into everyday life in a way that I could understand. And so I was saved at a very early age. I placed my faith in Christ when I was 3 years old. And I know there's debate over whether or not a child that young can believe, but it was very real. It was very real for me. I remember it. And I remember just the change in my heart afterwards, desiring what was good and feeling grief over my sin and wanting to follow Christ. And so I'm very grateful for that foundation. That being said, having experienced abuse, both in my church at age 7 and then with Larry, really caused me to wrestle with a lot of aspects of my faith and just understanding where God was and whether or not he even cared and how to properly handle theological concepts like grace and forgiveness, which is unfortunately not something the church does very well much of the time.
Mm-hmm. You said you were abused in church at age 7. Can you share a little bit about what took place there and then wrestling with that faith? Because sometimes when people go through traumatic events like this, they just put the hand to God and said, I'm good, and walk away from that. So walk us through such a young age 7. I hate hearing that. My daughter is 15, and I think about just what that would have been like going through that with her. Tell us what happened and then kind of just wrestling through the many years after with that faith.
Yeah, so at age 7, I was abused in my church, and actually the average age for a sexual assault victim is between 5 and 8 years old. So I fit that statistic very well, unfortunately. Yeah. And I experienced both in that abuse. I experienced both the positive response of adults who are trained to handle abuse properly, and I also experienced the negative. So there was a group of adults in my church who were trained sexual assault counselors, and they saw some of those warning signs, and they came to my parents and they said, "I think we might have a problem." And my parents, to their credit, immediately listened. They were growing uneasy with some of the dynamics they were seeing as well. And so they took immediate steps to protect me, not knowing, of course, that abuse had already occurred. But when they did that, because I hadn't verbalized the abuse at that point in time, there was another faction from the church, many of whom were our very close friends, who felt that my parents were being oversensitive and making accusations without foundation. And so by age 8, I was really reeling from abuse that I didn't understand and hadn't verbalized, and also from the loss of many of the adults that had formed my conception of God and the church and the Christian family, because those adults became very distant and icy. And I sensed that, I felt that, but I didn't understand why. And when I got to be around 12 years old, I disclosed to my parents and started asking questions about why we had left the church. And that's when I really started to put the pieces together and understood the full story about what had happened. And unfortunately, this church had a history of mishandling sexual assault and sexual sin in the church. I was not unique in that. But the message I really took away from that was, if you cannot prove your abuse, don't speak up, because it will cost you everything. And I didn't realize how much I had internalized that message, but I carried that with me into the exam room with Larry. And it really caused me to doubt my own judgment and my own intuition. And it let me know loud and clear, once I did realize who Larry was and began to realize what he was doing. I remembered that. And that's part of what informed my understanding of what it was going to take to stop an abuser. It can't be done quietly. You have to be able to wrest control, not just from the abuser, but from the community and the institutions that surround him.
Another topic I really want to hit on with you, and obviously as Christians, it's essential, is forgiveness. You've mentioned it a couple times. I wrote a book on this topic. I know how hard forgiveness is. I know the damage that bitterness and anger and rage can bring if you suppress it inside. And just thinking of C.S. Lewis once said, everyone agrees that forgiveness is a beautiful idea until we have to practice it ourselves. Walk us through that practice for you in your journey of forgiveness.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it is a journey and it's a process. And I think that's something that's important to understand. It's not a one-time momentary decision. But I think one of the most important things we as Christians need to understand is what the foundation of forgiveness is. Because very often Christians want to jump to the forgiveness as if forgiving ties things up with a neat little pretty bow. Yeah. And then everybody can move on. And it feels good. Christians like that warm, fuzzy feeling of everything being good and peaceful. And we have this mistaken idea that forgiveness erases the consequences, that it undoes the damage, that if you just forgive and you're at peace, that the trauma and the injuries of what you have been through will go away. And it's very damaging. There are many survivors that I speak with on a regular basis, who will be just weeping and saying, I've forgiven my abuser. Why am I still having nightmares? Why am I still having flashbacks? Why does the abuse still bother me? Did I do something wrong? Did I not forgive properly? I don't understand. Because the church has put this false pressure on them and this false perception that if they forgive, they become like they were before they were abused, and they stop having the wounds of their abuse. And that's something we need to really confront as we are teaching forgiveness, so that we don't put that false guilt on survivors and ourselves carry this false idea that forgiveness is a magic potion that fixes everything, because it doesn't. It's something we're commanded to do and it's important, but it does not erase the trauma and it does not erase the wounds and those injuries. And the second thing we really need to understand as Christians is the foundation of forgiveness. Very often we teach forgiveness without teaching the corresponding truth of justice, and both are found in the character of God. Forgiveness is almost treated oftentimes in the Christian church as a nice way to getting peace. And as if saying the magic words of forgiveness or responding to "and I'm sorry" almost minimizes or mitigates what's been done to you. But the reality, if we look at the atonement and the gospel, is that forgiveness is only possible because somebody paid the price. Somebody paid justice for that crime, for that offense. And when we fail to understand justice as the foundation for forgiveness, what ultimately happens is forgiveness becomes very cheapened, and we minimize the depth of the damage that is done through abuse. And so one of the most important things I think we need to do as believers is to hold our theology properly, to understand the corresponding truths of justice, and that justice is found in the character of God, and that forgiveness is only possible because justice is done. And survivors don't often hear that. Everyone wants to skip to the feel-good part of forgiveness without dealing with the reality and the horror and the evil of what's been done to them. And we need to preach both, because when we dim the depth of the evil, we have dimmed the holiness and the glory of God.
I remember the video that came out in January of 2018, and you faced Larry, and that is really where this took this to a whole nother level, I have to imagine. Obviously the Indy Star story, but being there facing Larry Nassar yourself. And I just want to read one of the quotes that you had to say, and it's still very prominent in my mind just thinking about when I watched it. It says, should you ever reach the point of truly facing what you have done, the guilt will be crushing, and that is what makes the gospel of Christ so sweet. And going a little bit further, you say, I pray you experience the soul-crushing weight of guilt so that you may someday experience true repentance and true forgiveness from God, which you need far more than forgiveness from me, though I extend that to you as well. I think, and that ends the quote, I think just if you're not a believer, this can be very hard, and even for people of faith, but it can be very hard for someone who doesn't have a faith to understand how you can show grace and mercy to someone who did such horrible things to you and to so many other people. Can you talk us through that day, just how hard that was for you to face him, and, you know, that message that you recognized? Maybe, I don't even know, did you recognize the platform that you were being given that at that moment to point people back to the gospel, which was incredible to watch? Talk about that day a little bit and facing Larry and what you had to say.
Yeah, that actually wasn't the first time I faced Larry in court, which again is part of that untold story, because for most people tuning in, this was the first time they had paid attention to the story.
Yeah.
But for me, it had already been 2 years of advocating on a national and international level, telling my story over and over again, helping journalists put the pieces together, understand the law, understand the medical dynamics. I had already testified at length against Larry in open court for almost 3 hours in a testimony that was broadcast, again, internationally and recorded and is out there online forever. I had been in court speaking on behalf of the victims of the child porn that was found on Larry's computer. And so this was not the first time I had seen him in court. This was not at all the first time that this was broadcast on a national and an international level, in my case, because of everything that it took to get to that courtroom. That being said, I did not understand the full reality of what was transpiring at that moment in time, because I was there for the survivors. I had been in court for the last 7 days to support the other survivors that were there and to be able to bear witness to their testimony and to be there for them. And so there was a degree to which I understood what was taking place, but the full depth of what was taking place in terms of how much the world was really watching, I didn't fully grasp yet. That being said, I thought one of the most important things to do, and the only thing that I really had left to say to Larry, was to point him back to the truth. Because what had taken place up to that point is frequently when we were in court together or when he had a sentencing hearing, Larry would bring in his Bible and he would talk about how he prays for the victims, prays the rosary for them, prays for the victims. Yeah. And he would point to the other good things that he has done as if that absolved him of guilt or minimized the guilt. And I wanted him to know that it didn't, that that's not the way to repentance and that's not the way to forgiveness. Because he needs to know that. He needs to hear the truth. And I didn't want him to be able to use Scripture and the Bible as a weapon to try to minimize or mitigate the evil that he had done. And again, I think that's something that as Christians we need to really wrestle with. When we minimize or mitigate evil, or we act like it's not as evil as it is, we really have dimmed the glory and the goodness of God. And I did not want him to be able to do that.
Let's talk about advice here in giving others. I think there's the survivors, and then there's the people who are really close to the survivors that may struggle. I know I've heard stories, and certainly I'm sure there's more stories than I've just heard of that exist, even in my little area here in Bristol, Connecticut, on supportive behavior of a loved one who suffers through abuse. What advice would you give? What should they do when, let's put it in your experience level from your family, your loved ones, your parents, when they found out about what had happened to you? What advice are you now giving to others, like, say, myself, if I found out somebody was being abused, in terms of caring for them, being there for them, loving them?
I think the very first thing that we need to understand is just the incredible amount of good and damage we have the capability of doing in how we respond to disclosures of abuse and how we walk alongside survivors. Yeah. Study after study has repeatedly shown that out of every crime perpetrated on a survivor, someone who survives the crime, it has by far the longest reaching ramifications, the highest rates of PTSD, the highest rates of substance abuse in response to the PTSD, the highest rates of suicidal ideations and self-harming behaviors. So the depth of sexual abuse and the damage that's done is really extreme. But the other thing that research has consistently shown is that the depth of that damage and the ability of a survivor to heal is definitively linked to the response they receive when they disclose. So there is an incredible opportunity to do just beautiful redemptive work, walking alongside a survivor. But there's also incredible ability to do damage to a survivor because you have a direct effect on how they will or will not be able to heal. And what we really need to understand as we walk alongside survivors is the depth of the damage that's been done to them and the lies that they so often hear. The false guilt and the blame and the shame, and the feeling of unworthiness or that they contributed to their abuse. And we need to be standing against those lies, speaking truth into those lies over and over again. We need to be standing against theologies that would minimize what this survivor has been through, that would seek to skip over the truths of justice and the reality of evil and treat forgiveness like it's a panacea for all ills. We need to resist the urge to want the warm fuzzies of a nice story and want everything tied up with a pretty little bow, and instead be willing to sit with the survivor in the brokenness. Because the reality is, on this side of heaven, we don't see full redemption. And we need to stop acting like it's possible to see full redemption and complete healing as if you become the way you were before you were abused. And instead point to the glory of that future hope, that future redemption. So those who are walking alongside survivors need to understand the ability that they have. They need to be able to handle their theology properly so that they can speak truth into the lies the survivor is hearing and really grieve with them in the brokenness.
Rachael Denhollander is our guest here on Sports Spectrum. A couple more questions with Rachael. The new book, again, is called What is a Girl Worth? And it is out now. Let me ask you about, I guess, the aftermath of when, I'm putting the time frame together. So that video comes out and it starts to kind of go pretty crazy here, viral, and everybody's covering it. And that's January of 2018. And here we are taping this interview in the fall of 2019 as the book is released. There's not a lot of time in between that, and yet the aftermath was quite a bit of media, quite a bit of you obviously doing interviews like what you're doing with me. What was that like initially after that moment in January, and suddenly you're thrust into the spotlight even more? You're doing interviews, you're writing this book, you know that you're going to be kind of having to rehash this thing for probably the rest of your life. But what was that like in the immediate aftermath? Did you kind of retreat a little bit, or did you more or less embrace it to understand the magnitude and the voice that the Lord was giving you on this platform?
It took a lot of just prayer and wisdom to really seek God's face in how far to go in advocacy. Again, that being said, though, for me and for my family, it was a continuation of what had already been taking place for the last 2 years. Even the journalists that I was communicating with from that point on, I had already been working with them for the previous 2 years to put the story together and to keep pushing it forward. And so in a lot of ways, it was a continuation of what we had begun. What I did not see or foresee was the potential good that could come out of it. I understood the depth of the cost that it would be for my family. I did not expect the amount of redemption in terms of the ability to advocate and educate that came from that. And you're right, it is very difficult to continue advocating and educating and even explaining to people why you continue talking about something that is so painful and that costs to continue dealing with it. There were times that Jacob and I had the conversation. I would say, what do you do when you can do a job really well? And it's a job that needs to be done, and it's a job you've been given, but it's a job you never wanted.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so the approach that we have really taken is, again, just a continuation of what we felt convictionally before, to simply be faithful with what we are given. And sometimes during the day that is faithful to homeschool our 4 children and to love them well and to nurture their hearts. And sometimes what we are given is a national platform. And you just be faithful with what you are given. And that's my desire.
Talk us through the conversations, if any, because you mentioned you got saved at 3 years old. And I think that's the youngest testimony we've ever heard on the 400 plus interviews here on the podcast, which is tremendous that you remember that. But you said you have 4 little ones yourself, and now you're homeschooling them and teaching them and molding them and loving them. But have they understood what's happened to mom here over the last year and a half, maybe even over the last 17, 18 years?
They understand a very little bit. My kids are very young. They're 7. My oldest son is 7, and then I have daughters who are 5, 4, and 14 months. And so more what they understand is that there was someone who hurt children, including mommy, and that he had to be stopped, and that it cost a lot to stop him. And we have those discussions with my kids because they have articulated how much it has cost them. Just the upheaval continuously to our family on a daily basis for the last couple of years. And that continues to this day. One phone call from an investigator or an attorney, because we are still fighting. I am still fighting on an almost daily basis the issues of reform in Michigan State University and some of the legal issues with USAG and the USOC. And so it is not uncommon for a phone call that simply has to be taken to completely derail our day, to have to pick up and go places for advocacy or for some of the legal battles we're still fighting, to just have to pick up with very little notice and transition the family for a brief time period so that we can take care of what I need to take care of. And that costs them. It's not just me. It costs my children too. And so they have articulated, I really wish that hadn't happened. I wish you didn't have to be gone so much. I wish all those children hadn't been hurt. Because they feel the impact on them as well. And so that's an opportunity for us to have the discussion. You're right. It's not fair. It's not fair that you guys have to be suffering the price as my children. It's not fair that mommy still has to deal with this. It's not fair that any of us still have to fight these battles. And that's why we want to teach you to do what is right. And that's why we want to teach you to love the people around you, because your actions impact others. And you can damage people that you will never even know. And this is the consequence of sin, and that's how ugly it is, and to run the opposite direction.
Interestingly enough, you didn't just write your memoir. Again, it's called What is a Girl Worth? But you also wrote a children's book. And
Yes.
Being the mom of 3 older children, and then certainly a 14-month as well, congratulations on that. But your book, the children's book is called How Much is a Little Girl Worth? And I just would have loved to have been able to read that book to my 5-year-old daughter. I guess she's 15 now, so 10 years ago. But why is it important to start even at a young age, as you wrote this book, and showing kids what their value and their worth is, even at 4, 5, 6 years old?
I think that's one of those ultimate life questions that all of us have to wrestle through, and that children wrestle through too. What am I worth? Where do I fit? Where does my identity come from? And our answers to those questions drastically shape the person that we become. It shapes how we make decisions. It shapes our emotional and spiritual health. And so to have those discussions with your children very early on is critically important, because our kids are constantly hearing messages about where their value comes from. Subtle messages of it's found in your beauty or in your sex appeal or in the grades that you get or your academic achievements, your athletic achievements. And we often treat what our kids do, even inadvertently, we treat what our kids do as the thing that gives them identity, the thing that gives them value. And that sets the stage for our child to really wrestle with and just be crushed by things that are done to them, as if something that's done to them damages their value, or to be crushed by, facing uphill struggles, by not being as successful in a particular area as perhaps they wanted to be, by something that they view as a failure. And our kids need to know, our girls need to know, that their identity is not found in something that they accomplish. It's not found in what society says about them or the opinions of others. It's found in how they were made, and that no one can change what God has done, that He has set that value upon them. He has created them in His image, and no person, not them and not somebody else, is capable of changing the value, the intrinsic value that God has given them. And then out of that flows how we treat the people around us and the decisions we make once you understand that message of how God has created all of us.
Rachael Denhollander, thanks so much for being here on the podcast. Last question, and we ask this to all of our guests. Very curious what your answer will be. What is the Lord teaching you today? What are you learning from God in the season of life where He has you right now, with all that you've been through and all that God still has planned for you? What are you learning from Him today?
I think one of the things, well, there are two things. I'll give you two, even though you didn't ask for two.
That's okay. Bring them.
I think the two things that have really stuck out to me the most through this process is just the beauty of redemption and God's holiness, particularly that final redemption, and allowing the evil that we see to point us to that the holiness of God and the beauty of God and the beauty of final redemption, being able to grieve the things that are evil and broken because they are grief worthy, and know that they are grief worthy because they stand in contrast to the perfect picture of love and sacrifice and holiness and perfection. And I think the other thing that has really struck me over the last couple of years is the importance of the little decisions that we make. Because when everybody tuned in to the sentencing hearing, they saw Larry for what he really was. They saw a gaunt man in a prison jumpsuit who everybody knew was a pedophile. But that's not who everybody thought Larry was 2 or 3 years ago. That's not who Larry thought he was. And when the first time that Larry chose to look at child porn, or that he chose to excuse his perverted desires, to excuse abusive behavior, he didn't know that he was setting the stage for becoming one of the worst pedophiles in recorded history. He didn't intend to be that person, but he became that person. Those little decisions, those decisions to minimize and to mitigate and to excuse and to justify wrong choices and harmful choices, set the stage for who he would become years later. And all of us, to some level or another, have to wrestle with that. All of us make little choices that we want to excuse or mitigate or justify, because we're tired or we're stressed or nobody understands what we're going through. But the reality is those little choices that we want to be small deals, those really set the trajectory of our life. Those shape, all those little tiny decisions shape who we will become. They shape what we prioritize and how we define good and evil. And the accumulation of those little tiny decisions has an enormous impact on who we are, and that impacts everyone around us. And so one of the things that I've just really been struck by over the last couple of years, and that's been very convicting to me, is paying even more attention to the very little decisions that I make. And on the converse side, one of the threads that you see through the memoir is the impact of the little decisions of people who chose to do the right thing. A detective who chose to investigate my case like it mattered, having no idea the can of worms that she was opening because she wasn't part of the gymnastics world. I can tell her, this doctor's really famous, I think it's going to be a big deal, but she had no idea the type of case she was investigating when she started. But she chose the right thing when so many others hadn't. And because she was the only detective out of 4 different law enforcement agencies who chose the right thing, she was able to literally change the world. We had a prosecutor who, again, had no idea what this case was going to become, but she took our case files and she said, I'm going to fight for all of them. That's what she told the detective, I'm going to fight for all of them. And she kept her word. And her decision to do the right thing when it seemed like just another case literally changed the world. And so the impact of the tiny little decisions we make, both for good and evil, really cannot be overestimated. And it's been very convicting for me to see that and to remember, as I'm making the little decisions every day with my family and my children, and just the personal moral decisions, that those set the trajectory for my life, and it shapes what I view as right and wrong. And I need to make sure those little decisions are in accordance with what is true and right and good.
Rachael Denhollander, thank you so much for being here on the show. The new book, again, is called What is a Girl Worth? And the children's book, How Much is a Little Girl Worth? They're both amazing, really. And you're a very courageous person. We thank you for your courage, for your honesty, for your bravery. You're making a huge difference, and I pray that God continues to use you for his glory and making an even bigger difference going forward. Thanks so much for being here on the show and sharing your story, and we wish you nothing but the best.
Thank you so much for having me and having the conversation.
Many thanks to Rachael Denhollander for joining us here on Sports Spectrum. The new book, What is a Girl Worth? It's a memoir, Rachael's life, Rachael's courageous story, and it is available now everywhere books are sold. It's as in-depth and, like I said in the beginning of the interview, as transparent a book as you'll ever read. And I'll just read a little bit on page 323 what she wrote about trying to move forward here. She said, "So much work remains, so much evil to fight, so much healing to reach for, so many wounded to love. Consider this your invitation to join in that work, to do what is right no matter the cost, to hold to the straight line in the midst of the battle, to define your success by faithfulness in the choices you make. The darkness is there, and we cannot ignore it, but we can let it point us to the light." That's the very last words that Rachael wrote in her book. Again, it's called What is a Girl Worth? And guys, we need to read this. All the ladies need to read it. Our kids need to hear about this story, obviously, for the level that they can comprehend and understand. And Rachael's children's book, How Much is a Little Girl Worth? Is also available. You can get that if you have little kiddos and read that story. Rachael's in many ways a hero, and it was an honor to talk to her. Sometimes I wonder if I'm even qualified to talk to people like Rachael, because what she's doing is so great and so important and so worthwhile, not only bringing a voice to the voiceless, but to do it with a heart for the gospel and a heart for Jesus, and really finding the only place that true hope can be found is in the cross of Christ. And so many thanks to Rachael. I really do appreciate her being here on the show. We also appreciate you for listening. If you have any feedback on this interview, we would welcome it. You can reach me, jason@sportspectrum.com on email, or you can just find us on social media. We read Twitter and Instagram and Facebook every day, and check your comments there. Let's keep this story going. It's an important one, and it needs to be told. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time right here on Sports Spectrum.